right, let's get started. Hello, so welcome to Open Source from the Trenches, Lessons Learned Creating a Popular .NET Open Source Library. So just a couple of moments about me. My name is James Newton King. I'm a developer from Wellington, New Zealand. I originally made these slides for NDC Oslo, so slight modification required. I'm a developer and consultant at a New Zealand company called Intergen. If you are interested in moving to New Zealand, you could potentially come work for us. But what I'm most known for is working on JSON.NET, and the experiences of that will form the basis of this talk today. So first thing I want to talk about, and sort of as a disclaimer, say that my experiences in open source could potentially be different from a lot of other people's. So there are many different kinds of open source projects. There's large collaborative projects, so for example, Script.cs. There's a lot of developers working on that project together. There are open source projects that are run by companies, and a lot of people who contribute to it are paid employees of a company. So Microsoft on the .NET framework and ASP.NET, that's an example. And then there are projects that just have one or two main contributors. So examples of that are AutoMapper and AutoFac. And JSON.NET also falls into that last one. And as well as there being many different types of projects, there are many different ways of contributing. So you could be someone who's just contributing via creating issues or reporting bugs. You could submit pull requests, or you could create a project and run a project, i.e. be a project maintainer. So my experiences are sort of based around being a project maintainer of a large open source project by myself. So in this talk, I'm going to sort of walk through the history of JSON.NET and sort of talk about what I've learned along the way. So we'll start at the start. How did JSON.NET get started? So I originally started JSON.NET because of an ASP.NET web forms control I was working on. So it was sort of a JavaScript dialog control. So those are sort of JavaScript dialogues nested within a browser. And it was for web forms. It was a dialog control similar to what you might find for jQuery or Bootstrap. By today's standards, it's nothing special. But back then, when everyone was going crazy over Ajax and, oh, look, we can update a div without refreshing the entire page, it was all right. I was pretty happy with it. Has anyone here written a lot of web forms? Okay, I'm really sorry. So here we can see a bunch of web form isms. So we've got the good old run at server. Does anyone miss run at server? One hand, you're sick. We've got the data source embedded directly in the page. So this would have been some Microsoft project manager, program manager way back in 2005. He could demo dragging and dropping a SQL data source onto a web form and then configure the SQL data source directly within Visual Studio, and then the SQL would be embedded directly in the view. That was a bad time. There's styles hard-coded directly against the control. Who needs CSS? Not Microsoft. And at runtime, I'm sure this web form control was probably outputting many kilobytes into the view state and getting posted back with every web request. So it was all pretty awful, but I was happy because I didn't know any better as a Microsoft developer at the time. Some people spent their teens and 20s doing drugs. I did web forms. So the problem was my web control. It was very JavaScript driven. All the values are being set in the view on the server. But web forms, it was really designed about writing HTML. It was sort of designed back in 2000, 2001 with the birth of .NET. So I could write the initial HTML no problem. So the HTML is where I would then inject the JavaScript control using JavaScript. But I needed a way to take all the values that I had set on the server and then send them to JavaScript, so write them to the view. And My first cut, as you can see here, is I tried to do everything manually. Within code, I would check, did someone set whether there is an overlay displayed when the JavaScript dialog is displayed? And if yes, then I wrote it out. Is there a width set? If yes, I'll write it out. Was there a height set? If yes, I'll write it out. But it was all very verbose and manual and error-prone, and I wasn't very happy with it. And I looked at that, and I thought, you know, what I'm really doing is on the server, I'm setting some configuration, and then I'm sending it to the client. What I really want to do is I want a data format that I can serialize all my data to, and then on the client, I just read it. So I did what any developer would have done back in 2006. I used XML. Specifically, I used XML serializer. So it was super easy on the server, one line and you're done. But I quickly discovered that XML, it's a real pain in the ass to work with in JavaScript. First, you need to load that entire string into a document, which is easier said than done because of all the different browsers and the way they do XML slightly differently. Then you need to do stuff like document.getElement by name, and you give it overlay visible, and you check whether that returned a result or not. And if it did, then you give that element, and you'd extract the value from it. And it was horrible. And even a relatively experienced developer like me at the time could tell that this was wrong. This wasn't the best approach. So fortunately, at the same time, well, just after, I discovered JavaScript object literals. And suddenly, the JavaScript was easy. So this is what I just wrote out to test it. And it was easy because I was working literally with a normal JavaScript object. The parsing was done when that script tag was parsed. And I didn't really need to do anything. I just had a JavaScript object ready to go. But now I had a new problem, and that was creating the JavaScript object literal. I couldn't find any .NET libraries to do it. So that was the beginning of JSON.NET. So the first version was released back in June 2006, so just over 10 years ago. And at the time, I just, once I had finished writing it and using it with my web dialog, I wrote a blog post, I zipped up some source code in a DLL file, and uploaded it to my blog, and that was pretty much it. Now, at the time, JSON was so new, so JSON was also defined as a standard back in 2006 by Douglas Crockford, that a lot of classes in JSON.NET didn't actually start with the word JSON. So if you're familiar with JSON convert, so JSON convert.serialize object, deserialize object, and objects like JObject and JArray, they were originally JavaScript convert, JavaScript array, JavaScript object. And it wasn't until a couple of releases later when the terminology JSON caught on that I started renaming things. And this photo, it's of Wellington, so that's where I live. I'm guessing the fireworks are to celebrate Guy Fawkes and not the release of JSON.NET. So what I found with starting JSON.NET is open source starts with solving a problem. It starts with one or two developers. They've got a problem that they need to solve, and they see the opportunity to solve it or take something and do it better. And then it just so happens that along the way, they take what they've done in their project and they just put it online. I was talking with Jimmy, who wrote AutoMapper, and he said that he wrote AutoMapper just because he needed to use it at work. And it wasn't until 9 months later that he just happened to turn it into a project and upload it to GitHub. And it's quite amazing how many similar popular .NET projects started up in this way. So we've got nlog, and we've got NUnit, mock, and AutoMapper, and then JSON.NET. So at this point, you've got a library, and maybe you've put it up somewhere for people to use. Where do you go from there? There are a couple of options. You could leave your blog post in GitHub and have it on NuGet and just allow developers to discover it organically. Or maybe you could go out and proactively reach out to developers and let them know that you've created something and that it exists. And I think this reaching out to developers is something that we're not really familiar with. It reaches outside our comfort zone. We're good at writing code. We can write an open source library, but how do we get people to actually start using it? So with JSON.NET, part of the reason I released it as open source. So I originally wrote it because I had a problem that I needed to solve. Part of the reason I released it was because I had a brand new blog and I wanted content for my blog and I wanted to get traffic. So when I released JSON.NET, I wrote a blog post and then I sort of submitted it to a number of news sites. So the one you can see here, this is Ajaxian. So back in 2006, Ajax was a big buzzword of the day, and Ajaxian was like the hub of tech for some reason. So I submitted a blog post here, and they republished it, and I got quite a few hits, which was great. So also, fun fact, Scott Hanselman was the very first commenter of the very first blog post about JSON.NET. And I'm pretty sure he found his way to my blog probably via Ajaxian. 14 minutes later, he also then submitted the first bug. So thank you very much, Scott. But he gave a lot of great detail. You don't usually get bug reports that detailed. So what I found with reaching out to developers is that that first blog post is quite important. And what you want is you want something that explains the problem that your project solves and how easy it is to use. And I think this is actually something I didn't do very well with JSON.NET. My first blog post was sort of more technically focused on some low-level achievements. So I wrote a forward-only JSON reader and a forward-only JSON writer that were very memory efficient. And that's sort of what I showed off on my blog. But commenters would come along and they'd look at that and say, that's kind of hard to use. I don't want to use that. Now, that first release of JSON.NET, it had a serializer. Like, you could serialize things in just one line, but I didn't show that off. So I think nailing that first blog post is key. And once you've done it once, you can then sort of reuse that content. So if you ever in the future want to have a basic website, you can just take that initial description and reuse it. If you have documentation, you can take those basic quick start guides and reuse them. So a good elevator pitch for your open source project is always useful to have. And if you really want to go a step beyond, you can create a screencast video. So Anthony and Nick from the Glimpse project, they made a screencast of showing off Glimpse. And as you can see, it ended up with over 40,000 views, which is really quite remarkable. And they credited it a lot with helping popularize Glimpse in the beginning. So you've written a blog post. Where can you submit it? Ajaxian is not the tech powerhouse that it used to be. The first place is social media. So you can tweet it, and Reddit's another place you can go. There's a couple of good subreddits you can look at. The ASP.NET team and the .NET team at Microsoft also do their part to sort of evangelize open source projects and blog posts that community members write. So the ASP.NET team has a weekly community stand-up video that they stream live. And as part of it, there's a John Galloway Loves Community section, and he sort of will sort of plug open source projects and blogs that have contacted him throughout the week. And then likewise, the .NET team, they have a weekly blog post with links to .NET-related blog posts, and they also focus on NuGet packages, so one a week. They also focus on a Xamarin game app once a week, and also a Unity game. And the final place I'd really recommend is Stack Overflow. So Stack Overflow is the place people go when they've got a problem. And if you can get to Stack Overflow and find people who have an issue that your open source project solves, you can answer them, you can show them how it's done, and then you can just link back to your blog post or website or NuGet package or GitHub. And this is actually something I did quite a lot with JSON.NET. Back when Stack Overflow started up, I would look through it occasionally, and I'd find questions from people who had issues that perhaps JavaScript serializer, which is built into .NET, or data contract JSON serializer, also built into .NET. If they had issues that those libraries didn't solve, I'd show them how JSON.NET solved them, and then I'd link them back to my website. And some of those questions now have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views. So it's the sort of thing which really pays off over time. So I will share with you my number one tip for getting developers' attention. So this is the one weird trick to make developers lose weight or something. So developers love performance. They love comparing performance. They love talking about performance. They love seeing performance improve. How often have you heard someone say, "You should try X. I hear it's really fast." So what I've noticed over time, so every version of JSON.NET, well, not every version, but most versions of JSON.NET I released, I write a blog post. And as part of that blog post, I quite often will sort of highlight some performance improvement I've made. So in this release I did a couple of years ago, I really improved how F# discriminated unions serialize and deserialize. I went from a whole bunch of reflection happening every time to cache reflection. And I've noticed that developers, when they see blog posts that talk about performance, they're much more highly upvoted, liked, shared, whatever, than other ones. So I've noticed this so much that when I sort of sat down and I decided to come up with like a tagline for JSON.NET, sort of like a short one-line description, so I built it straight into the description. So JSON.NET is a popular high-performance JSON framework for .NET. So if you're doing this, don't lie about performance. So you want to keep performance in mind. You want to work on it. You want it to be fast, but don't lie about performance. Don't be a dick and cook up scenarios where you win and your benchmark is the best and everyone else loses horribly. And also, don't obsess about being the fastest. There'll always be some library that will take what you've got and maybe they'll move some perhaps useful feature and like suddenly they're faster in the benchmarks, but maybe they're harder to use. JSON.NET isn't the fastest serializer, so there's a serializer called JIL, J-I-L, which is faster, and it does that by using IL-emit heavily, which means pretty much whenever you want to serialize a type, it uses IL-emit to pretty much generate a custom serializer on the fly that's tuned exactly for your type. So it means JIL is faster, but it also means because it uses IL-emit, it can't run everywhere because IL-emit isn't supported in ahead-of-time compilation. So yeah, there are pros and cons, but my recommendation is always just think about performance and sort of highlight it when talking about your library. Developers eat it up. So now I want to talk about motivation. So what has motivated me to keep working on JSON.NET? So at this point, I had something which worked for me. It solved my problem. I'd put it out there on my blog, and my blog was getting lots of hits. At this point, I felt like I was done. It was time to walk away. So yeah, it works for me. I've got popular blog posts. I was also, when I started working on JSON.NET, I'd only finished university like a year earlier. I only had one job ever, so it was something to put on my resume. And this wasn't just something that I felt. When people asked me, they would ask me what my plans were. I would say I was done. So way back in 2006, this is an email conversation between a couple of other people who wrote JavaScript and JSON libraries in .NET. So Ajax.NET Pro and JRock, they're sort of both focused more on web services rather than just core JSON like JSON.NET was. And at the time, they were considerably more popular. Yeah, and this was just a discussion. What do you think about combining our libraries? And my response to them is, you're completely welcome to take what I've done and reuse it and learn from it, but I feel like I've achieved all I want to achieve, and I'm going to go work on something else which interests me. And at the time, that is what open source felt to me. It felt like you would put out a blog post, or maybe you'd write an article on code project, and then you'd be done and you'd go work on something else. So what changed? Why did I keep working on it? So would you believe it was Codeplex? So I may have just made some old Codeplex project manager's day. So I made one final release of JSON.NET to Codeplex. And part of the reason I did that was, at the time, the source code was sort of hosted in Visual SourceSafe on my desktop in my room. Like, it's JSON.NET's that old. It started out in Visual SourceSafe. And the zip file was like sitting in a subdirectory underneath my .NET-powered blog. But what I didn't realize at the time when I moved to Coplex is I was suddenly getting all these new features and ways of interacting with the community. So suddenly I had discussions. I had ways to have people come along and request new features and talk about how they were using JSON.NET. Issues for bugs. People could submit reviews, and I could see statistics of how downloads were growing and people were adopting it. Source code, it was TFS at the time. I think the way you collaborated and submitted code was you'd go into Coplex, like you would download a zip file containing all the source code, and you'd unzip it, you'd make some changes, and you'd zip it back up again, and you'd upload it back to Coplex, then I would have to download it, then I'd have to unzip it, then I'd have to manually merge things. It was awful. But otherwise, Coplex was, it was all right. So without realizing it, suddenly I had a community. So I could talk with people. I could learn how they were using JSON.NET, what was easy, what was hard. And for me, this was a motivation. I think I like programming challenges, and I think this is true for most developers. Otherwise, during our spare time, we'd go off and climb mountains and row kayaks and stuff. But I prefer my programming challenges to be practical rather than theoretical. And seeing people practically use my library in the real world and have issues with it, and then I'd come up with a fix for it, and suddenly their real world example was much better. And that was really motivating for me. Of course, sometimes having a community can be difficult. You don't always agree. And things can quickly escalate then if you do something that they don't like. But that's working with developers. And it's better, yeah, sometimes it's annoying, but for most part it's a great time. So since I started way back then just having source code on my blog and download and a link, the ways of interacting with people in the open source community has continued to grow. So I talked about it earlier, there's issues and on Coplex and GitHub. NuGet has really revolutionized the way that open source developers and regular .NET developers acquire open source. And also you can see on NuGet quite comprehensive stats of how your library has been downloaded. And also you can see other libraries take dependencies on you, which you wouldn't have seen before. You've got sites like TechEmpower who do benchmarks. And in my case, so TechEmpower is mainly focused on web benchmarks. But in my case, there's a blog called Burning Monk, which looks more at .NET serialization. It does benchmarks of different libraries in that space. And this has really pushed open source developers to be better and faster competing against each other, being measured against each other like this. Git and GitHub and other distributed source control systems have obviously made contributing and collaborating much easier. And finally, Twitter has really revolutionized ways for people to come along and tell you that you're wrong and you're bad and you should feel bad. So 2 years after I first released JSON.NET, adoption really started to grow. I was getting a lot of downloads, and with all those downloads, I was also getting a lot of requests for help. What went from maybe one question a week had become maybe one or more a day. So here's a graph of JSON.NET downloads from Coplex over time, and it's kind of interesting to look at. It's got a really weird shape. Unfortunately, Coplex didn't put years on that. I don't think they expected people to still be using it in 10 years. So we can see here, back in November 2014, I mirrored downloads onto GitHub. And as soon as I did that, so most people started downloading things from GitHub rather than Coplex, although still quite a surprisingly large number of people do use Coplex for downloads. We can see in January 2011, I first uploaded the package to NuGet, and after that, sort of downloads from Coplex sort of started to level off as more people use NuGet to acquire the library rather than downloading a zip file. And you can see way back in March 2008, so that's when I released JSON.NET 2. And although it looks kind of small at the time, when I released JSON.NET 2, sort of downloads pretty much doubled, I was very excited about that blip back then. It doesn't look so impressive now. So I think it was about 2008, 2009 is when I really started feeling overwhelmed. And it wasn't just that people were asking for help, it was that they were asking for help not because of bugs in the library or because of missing features. The features were there that they needed. It's just they didn't know about them. They didn't know how to use them. So it was at that point I really started to put some effort into writing documentation. And the first thing I learned is XML documentation alone by itself isn't enough. So XML documentation, that's the thing, it's the text that you see when you use IntelliSense. And also a lot of websites like MSDN, you can sort of build HTML from it, and it sort of becomes the API documentation. Now this kind of XML documentation is useful, maybe if you want to find out what an individual class or method does, but it really doesn't help developers solve high-level problems. So if we use a metaphor of a coffee machine, you can think of XML documentation kind of like low-level descriptions of all the different parts in the coffee machine. Now, if you're familiar with the coffee machine, you could probably use this sort of documentation to figure out how to make a cup of coffee, or maybe you've just got a lot of time and a lot of patience, and you're happy to experiment. But what you really want as a user is you want a high-level guide telling you how to achieve your goal. You want a cup of coffee, here is the library, the coffee machine to do it for you, and here is how you use it. So the other kind of documentation I found was really useful is developers, they love examples. They just want to see an example of their problem, their exact problem being solved, and then they want to copy it. So it's not the best way to improve as a developer, but that's the way developers apparently like to work. So back in 2012, I had a long flight back from a conference in Europe. So flying back from Europe to New Zealand, it's about 35 to 40 hours, many flights, a lot of layover. And I was coming back from a conference, and I was super energized about a conference about open source. So my goal in that 40-hour flight was to write 100 samples for JSON.NET. I did not get there. I think I maybe got up to about 50. But you can see sort of like a list of them down on the left-hand side of that screenshot. But this one example alone, this was the most popular one. It gets thousands and thousands of views every month. And altogether, those examples probably get over 100,000 views every month. It's really quite remarkable. So another thing I learned for reducing support, the amount of time you need to give support, is how your library fails is important. So one of my passions is .NET API design. So this is the only sort of time I'll jump into that in this talk. But you can think when you're using a library, even though I've just said documentation is really important, users don't tend to read documentation at first. So if they encounter a problem, they're going to try and solve it a little themselves, and then when they concede defeat, they'll go off and look at Stack Overflow or Google or the documentation. So what you want is if a user fails, you want to let them know why they failed. So in this code sample up here, this is the most common error people tend to have with JSON.NET. You've got a person which has hobbies. The hobbies is a collection, but the user is trying to deserialize a string into that collection, which will work. They don't match up. So the error I originally got in the initial versions of JSON.NET is I'd tell them this. expected JSON array contract got JSON string contract. So that's using a lot of low-level internal types that really doesn't help the user. And the user gets that, and they were all very confused. I used to get tons and tons of support requests about that. And probably on Stack Overflow, there were lots of questions. What's this error mean? So I started improving on it. So this was V2 of that error message. Error converting system string to type ilist string of string. And that certainly improved it. It reduced the number of support requests. But it still was the most common way, was still the most common problem people were having with JSON.NET. So I improved it some more. So error converting the value, then I'd tell them the value to the type, and then I'd give them a path to it in the JSON. So that hobbies represents the hobbies to the left of the string. And then I'll give them the line number and the position. And so once I got to that level of detail, most developers could pretty quickly figure out, hey, wait a second, the hobbies that I was trying to deserialize into that ilist as a string, those don't match up. And if you compare it to the original error, yeah, it's really night and day when it comes to solving your problem. So those are a couple of my tips on how you should give support. How shouldn't you give support? So if someone asks for any help over any of these mediums, I say no. And the reason I say no is because they simply don't scale. When you answer a question, you want to answer it once and have it somewhere that is easily searchable and discoverable and have other developers reuse your answer multiple times in the future. So where should you give support? Stack Overflow. John Skeeter's nodding. So my reply to developers asking for help on GitHub is I'll close their issue and I'll say, please repost this on Stack Overflow because I use Stack Overflow for support. Now, the great thing about Stack Overflow is not only is it easy to search, both via its own search and also via Google. Google rates Stack Overflow quite highly. There are also many, many developers on Stack Overflow eager to answer questions. Everyone loves Stack Overflow reputation. So if there's only one of you, there's probably like a dozen people interested in answering questions about JSON.NET or more on Stack Overflow. So the screenshot here you can see is of the JSON.NET tag. So I recommend when you've got an open source project, encourage the usage of a tag. And that way people can use that tag to quickly find more help about JSON.NET. You can see here there's about almost 6,000 questions about JSON.NET on Stack Overflow. And some of those questions over on the left, they've got hundreds of thousands of views. If you're just one developer answering each developer's questions one by one, it's obviously completely impossible. So I recommend using Stack Overflow as a resource. So as well as making it easier for developers to help themselves and sort of scaling your support, to avoid going insane, you need to invest in making your own development easier. So one of the best things I ever did when working on JSON.NET is I took an entire day during one weekend many years ago, and I sat down and I learnt PowerShell, and I learnt Sake. So Sake is a sort of a build script, a build library for Sake, for PowerShell, sort of similar to make and rake and cake. And I built a script that would build JSON.NET and the many versions of JSON.NET. So there's a version of JSON.NET for .NET 2 and 3.5 and 4 and 4.5 and Silverlight and so on and so on. It would build all those together into a NuGet package. It would build the documentation. It would run all the tests and tests for each one of those different libraries. It would package everything together in a zip file, and it would do that all with one click of a button. And the time invested in doing that has probably repaid itself dozens of times over, back again. So as well as just being able to run that on my own local machine to verify that there aren't any issues in JSON.NET, I've been able to take it and put it on a build server. So in the screenshot here you can see is AppVeyor. So AppVeyor is a .NET-focused website that offers building a build server as a service. And I really recommend it. It's super easy to get started and get going. Like, you can literally create an account, point it at a GitHub repo, maybe a little bit of configuration to tell it where the solution is, and then this thing will just go off and it'll get you a content, it'll download it onto itself, and it'll build your project. It's really easy. And it also has a free option for open source projects. So for things I haven't automated, I like to make checklists. So this is my official, real JSON.NET release checklist, completely unchanged. So I run through this checklist every time I release a new version of JSON.NET. For the most part, it's automated, but there are a couple of things I do manually in there. And the reason I find this useful is quite often with open source, there's big periods of time in between releasing new versions. So sometimes it might be a week between JSON.NET releases because there's an urgent bug. Sometimes it might be 6 months. And having a checklist means I'm confident that if I follow this checklist, I'm going to put out a good release of JSON.NET. I'm not going to break everyone because I forgot to strong name, or I forgot to increment the version number, or I forgot some file out of the NuGet package. And yeah, if I break JSON.NET, all hell will break loose. And finally, the most important investment I think you can make in making development easier is unit tests. So unlike a commercial project you might be working on with lots of other developers, there is no test team. There are no testers to double check that the release that you're about to put out to the wild is good. So you need unit tests to be able to capture any mistakes you might make, and also capture anything, regressions you make, and any breaking changes you inadvertently make. So I've put a lot of effort into unit testing with JSON.NET. So you can see there's about 2,500 unit tests in the top left corner. And also, I quite like to use code coverage. So JSON.NET has between 90 and 95% code coverage. So that's hitting all the important paths. And before I release a new version of JSON.NET, quite often I'll run code coverage, and then I'll go look at the feature I've just added, and I'll just make sure that there's a test hitting all the important lines before it goes out into the wild. So I think the main takeaway I've learned while working on JSON.NET, as it's just growing in such a huge scale, is you do need to take time to invest in making your own life easier when it comes to doing development. Don't get too focused on solving the problem of the day that a user approaches you with. Otherwise, things just become completely unwieldy and messy and horrible, and it stops being fun to work on. Having a lot of unit tests that you can rely on means I've been able to go into JSON.NET and make some quite enormous changes to the way the internals work as I've learned and grown as a developer. And if I didn't have all those unit tests, I simply wouldn't have the confidence to do that because I would introduce bugs without myself knowing. So now I want to talk about people. So dealing with people, it's interesting. So what I want to focus on here is how to maintain your enjoyment while still interacting with other developers. So focus on what can you do to keep your mental health. So this is a pretty funny tweet by a guy who used to work at GitHub, and I think it's quite easy for it to become true. And the reason I think it becomes true is because of what you as an open source maintainer see of users who are adopting your library. So what you see as an open source maintainer is really just a tip of an iceberg. The main way you see developers is via GitHub issues. And GitHub issues are usually only when people come to you when they've got a problem. So there's bugs, or there's features requests, or there's something that you haven't touched in so long, or they want strong naming, or they don't want strong naming. That being the main way that you interact with users and that you see users using your library can sort of color your perception of like the entire success or failure of your library. If everyone who's talking to me about JSON.NET is having problems, then I must be doing an awful job. I must be horrible. I should just give up and stop. But what you realize is that sort of below the tip of the iceberg is there's just a silent majority of developers using your library and getting stuff done. Like, they might still be having maybe an issue, they don't know how to do something, but they go to the documentation and they fix it. Maybe they go to Stack Overflow and they fix it. But they've solved their problem and they're happy and they've moved on to something else. And those are the developers you don't really see. So the other thing I'd recommend with working with people is don't be afraid to say no. So I've already mentioned that if people come to me for help, I just say, please direct questions to Stack Overflow. And maybe if someone doesn't answer your question, maybe because it's quite difficult, I'll look at it after maybe a week or so. And also say no to features that you don't want. I think there's a lot of pressure to merge every pull request or add every feature. Not all pull requests are good, not all features are good. And I've had to do this quite a lot with JSON.NET. So for years, people used to ask me to make a web framework that exposed JSON.NET. They'd say, we hate WCF and we hate the way it does JSON. Can you please turn JSON.NET into a web framework? And I said no, because I knew if I started developing a web framework, then I'd need to worry about stuff like doing authorization and authentication and caching. It would have been an entirely new project by itself. And I already had more than enough to work on with JSON.NET. So it's important like you put a boundary around what you want to work on and then focus within that boundary. And yeah, my reply to most other people who asked that was, okay, someone else can do it. And eventually someone did. So Microsoft then adopted JSON.NET when they built Web API. So this is another good tweet. You can say no now and maybe reconsider it in the future, but as soon as you say yes, you kind of need to support it forever. So with JSON.NET, I'm often quite patient, and if I get a feature request that I'm a little unsure about, I just think about it for a while. Maybe I'll say no, maybe I'll say yes. But yeah, don't give in to the pressure to merge every pull request and do every feature. And something I really recommend is guiding your contributors. So GitHub supports this idea of a contributing markdown file. And in this file, you can sort of give instructions about, you can give instructions to contributors, so people creating new issues or pull requests, about how to contribute to your project. So with the one I've written for JSON.NET, I sort of explain what information I need to be able to reproduce your bug. So I need, if you've got an issue serializing stuff, I need the JSON, I need the class, I maybe need whatever settings you're using. If you want to submit a pull request, I tell people, could you please, if it's a big pull request, mention a feature to me first, because I don't want to reject all your changes that you've put a lot of work into. So GitHub, once you've created this contributing markdown file, it's then visible whenever someone creates a new issue or a new pull request. So you can see up there, please review the guidelines for contributing to this repository. So that's a link to that markdown file I just mentioned earlier. So finally, I'll end with why open source? Why do all this work? It seems like a lot of hassle and a lot of heartache. And I'll start off with a slightly controversial topic, and that will be of money. So the first ever talk I did about open source was called Successful Open Source. And before I even started talking, someone in the audience asked me, so is this where you tell us how to make money? And that's some people's view of open source. It's successful when it starts making money. And of course, this isn't necessary, but some open source projects do grow quite large. I mean, quite time consuming for people who work on it and maintain it. So I thought I'd just give a couple of moments into talking about money and my experiences. So has everyone watched South Park? So South Park has this episode about these gnomes that steal underpants. And they have this business plan. So step 1 is steal underpants. Step 2, we're not quite sure yet. Step 3, profit. So in the context of open source, I will tell you what step 2 is not. And it's not do nothing. So if you've got a popular open source project that maybe some big Fortune 500 company has started using, and maybe it saved that Fortune 500 company maybe hundreds of developer hours, you probably shouldn't expect them to just come along out of nowhere and give you a check and say, this is for all the time you've saved us. Good work. That doesn't happen in my experience. So if that doesn't work, what can you do? So one option is sponsorship. So this is what the Glimpse guys have, what they used to do with Redgate. So Redgate sponsored Nick and Anthony to work on Glimpse for a couple of years. I know Nancy also had some sponsorship, so a company needed Nancy to run on .NET Core, and they sponsored one of the developers to work full-time on Nancy for a while to upgrade it to .NET Core. You can do commercial add-ons, so this is something I do, and also Hangfire. So Hangfire is like a .NET scheduling library, and we both sell add-ons. You can do commercial support and training and consulting, and an example of a company who does this is the people behind NService Bus. So there are lots of options out there. It's hard to know what would work for your project if you wanted to go in that direction. But that's sort of true, I guess, of everything. So another reason you might do open source is to learn new things. Working on open source gives you the opportunity to work on and learn things you might never would have otherwise. So this list is just some things off the top of my head that I either did for the first time or did for the only time while working on JSON.NET. You can see unit testing is up there. JSON.NET was the very first time I ever did unit testing. And if you look at the state of the JSON.NET unit tests, you would believe me because they're a mess. And as well as those, there's sort of more intangible things you can learn. So I've learned sort of how to interact with other developers, sort of customers, if you will, requesting features and having to sort of say no and explain to them why they can't have something. You sort of also learn how to be responsible about managing a project, putting out a good release, maintaining quality. And then there's also just the confidence that you can create a library of code that's used by hundreds or maybe thousands of developers around the world, and they can get stuff done, and they can use your stuff, and your stuff can solve problems. Another thing that's really great is you can be used by other great apps. So one of the things I enjoy most is seeing how other people use JSON.NET. So since I started working on it, it's become part of Azure, RavenDB, it ships with ASP.NET. A lot of NuGet is quite heavily JSON-based, and they use JSON.NET. And even full JSON databases, RavenDB and DocumentDB, it's absolutely amazing that they would use JSON.NET. And as well as these apps, I absolutely love playing computer games, but I really have no desire to go and make my own one. So seeing JSON.NET being used in computer games is really amazing. It's something that I never would have imagined. Seeing it used in games that I quite enjoy, like Halo and Pokemon Go, it's pretty cool. And you can meet interesting people. When you go to a conference, you quite often instantly have something interesting to talk about. You can talk about either they're a user and you can just talk about their experiences using your open source project, or maybe their fellow open source maintainers. You can talk about how each project is going. And this is really great for me. I'm a bit of an introvert, and it's great to have something just to talk about at conferences with other people. And yeah, you meet great people and sort of get to know them that you might not have otherwise, which is really awesome. And finally, open source lets you spread your ideas. So I think open source is a unique opportunity for developers. Earlier in the week, I went on a tour of the Sydney Opera House, and as we went through, the guide talked about the history of the Sydney Opera House and how it was built. And one of the things she mentioned is that when they originally started decided to make it, they put out a request for designs, and there were over 200 designs submitted. But only one was chosen and one was built. As developers, open source means that we can build our designs without having to be chosen. We can just, if we have a text editor and a compiler, we can just go ahead and do it. And that's really an amazing opportunity for us. And the other thing that open source gives us is the opportunity to build software how we think it should be built. So if we look at some of the different JSON serializers, each of us came from a slightly different perspective and built something slightly differently. So with JSON.NET, I've always had in my mind that the goal should be, it should be able to serialize and deserialize everything. And it should make the easy possible, it should make the simple easy and the hard possible. The person who wrote Jill, he actually works at Stack Overflow. He's very focused on performance. So his goal was speed, ultimate speed. And then there's another library by another developer called Simple JSON. And he just wanted simple that didn't have any dependencies on it. So his JSON serializer exists all just in a single file, no dependencies. So open source is a unique opportunity for us as developers to be able to spread our ideas to other people. So that's all I have time to talk to you about today. If you've found this talk interesting, there are a couple of other ones I recommend. Nick Moliner and Paul Betts have each talked about open source. These are actually both from NDC, strangely enough. Nick talks about open source process and governance, sort of more the organization of open source. And Paul focuses on growing an open source project's adoption and popularity. So I recommend those talks if you're interested in learning more. And that's it. I hope you've enjoyed my talk. I'll stay up the front for a while if you want to talk to me or ask any questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.